Gifted Talks Fundraising offers you a seat at the table for a relaxed chat about what it takes to build successful giving programs. Mastering decades of practical hands-on experience, the gifted directors share how they're addressing current challenges, providing helpful insights and top tips for achieving your fundraising targets. Welcome back to One Mill Street again, guys. It's amazing how these conversations come together, and I'm just so pleased today we're going to get an opportunity to talk about the whole question of schools' bursaries and how they're funded and what's appropriate in independent schools to do that. And with me today, obviously, is Amy Stevens, all the way from Leeds. Thank you, Amy, for travelling down the M1.
Good to see
and
you.
Chris Goldie up the M40 from London back to the centre of the universe here in Leamington Spa. So good to see you both, guys. And it's always good to catch up for a coffee. I think too these conversations have been really helpful for me, just learning from what you're learning out there. I mean, as fundraising consultants, we get really right into it with our clients, don't we? We walk the walk with them, and really it's quite a fast changing subject, this one, at the moment. A lot of things happening at government levels and so on. And given our work with the surveys, the gifted work we're doing with IDPE, we've got some really strong relationships here. So we're hopeful today we can bring that and share our distilled wisdom here. Chris, can I come to you first? Can you just describe what's going on out there? What are bursaries? And who are our independent schools? Can you set the scene for us?
Okay, so we have this curious system in this country, don't we, of calling our independent schools public schools, which has always really confused the world. Yeah. But they are essentially private schools, and as we know, they are currently the subject of quite hot debate politically around should they be charities, should VAT be charged on fees, etc., etc. But we're not here to talk about the politics. We're here to talk about what independent schools do in terms of support for talented young people who will thrive better, more often, in a private school setting where they're likely to have smaller classes, certainly better facilities in the main, not necessarily always better teachers. But certainly smaller classes, better facilities, and maybe a bit more of a focus on their particular strengths.
You can have these independent schools that are not just Eton, Harrow, whatever. It can be a school that's focused on special needs, for example, or a school that's got a particular strength in the arts or in sports. Or is that
absolutely? Yeah. I mean, the fact is the independent school sector covers pretty much everything that exists out there in society. I think what the public sees are the grand old private schools, the Etons and the Harrows and the Winchesters and the Cheltenham Ladies Colleges, and but that is a thumbnail's worth of schools. Yeah. The vast majority of independent schools are local. Yeah. They are hard-working families who send their kids there. This is not the toffs. This is not the wealthiest people in the country. We say to all of our clients, when you come to fundraising, probably 60% of your parents aren't going to give at all because they're spending all of their spare money on the school fees.
Yeah, fair point.
So I think it's really important to understand that what independent schools aspire to deliver a really consistent quality of education, a broader curriculum of interests that hopefully will end up with young people coming out after A-levels as good, grounded characters.
Ooh,
and most schools...
Rounded and
grounded. And if you ask most schools that we work with what their ambitions are for the kids, it's not X number of scholarships to Oxbridge or Princeton or Harvard or wherever it might be. It is actually what we want to produce are good young citizens of the future.
Thank you. So, and Amy, the history of funding of independent schools, private schools, some of which are public schools, has been quite interesting across the UK, hasn't it? I mean, this is where before the state started, providing education services, and so this is very much a local response, very often funded by philanthropy.
Like so, that's the interesting thing. Most work do have a history of philanthropy, don't they? Which is why it's so important that it continues and those bursaries kind of come full circle again.
Yeah, and we've seen over the years governments sort of step in and obviously they've been grammar schools ultimately to try and drive that academic outcome, but then with the politics against the grammar schools, some of those have fallen away, and we saw, didn't we not, direct grants. And then sort of assisted places.
Yeah.
What's that done, Chris, as far as the scene now as to giving? What's the scene? You've done a lot of work on the surveys. How are our independent schools, fundraising? Where are they seeing success? And most particularly, where's the bursary offer? And could you talk a little bit about what a bursary is today?
Okay, well, let's start with what a bursary is. A bursary is financial support for a student, and therefore the family of a student, that is not based necessarily on their academic ability or their sporting ability. It's not a scholarship. Historically, independent schools used to award scholarships based on academic merit, and that would give a slight discount on school fees. What a bursary is, it's much more means tested, and it provides financial support at different levels.
So the parents or the family would sit down and report on what their income, and then based on that, there'd be an assessment made on what level. So you might get a 10% subsidy or more.
Well, different schools would have different policies, and based really around how much money they've got to give away. Some schools will have significant endowments that will go back centuries. So Christ Hospital, for example, is always held up as being the school that gives away the most in bursary funds. And it does, but it has historic endowments that enables it to do so. Other schools do not have that level of endowment. Ironically, some schools are called endowed schools and have no endowment at all, which is really odd. But they were once endowed, going back to the point that Amy just made, they were once endowed by an individual locally who said, I'm going to create a school for 20, it would have been boys in those days, local boys to have an education. And that's so if you go into a Cotswold town, you'll find an old schoolhouse.
Yeah.
It's that sort of thing. But that's expanded now. So a bursary in the conventional sense is generally paid for out of a school's operational income. And a certain amount of money is set aside every year to provide a discount anywhere between 10 and, say, 80, 90% on school fees. The trend in recent years, and this is why schools are doing more and more fundraising, is to try and offer more significant, substantial bursaries so that actually the kids who get them are not kids from nice middle-class families who already earn a reasonable thing, but they're kids from nice working-class families who otherwise wouldn't have the opportunity to go to that school.
And Amy, what do you think the benefits are for that? How does that change a school if it's got, a much more diverse intake?
I think that's some of the feedback we get, isn't it, from donors to bursary funds from other parents saying, I want my child to grow up in an environment where all aspects of community are covered, all cultures, all backgrounds, and that brings that key benefit of, that well-rounded child that doesn't live in a bubble, that does understand others and how they live and what their lives look like. It's a major benefit as children grow up, isn't it?
There's a win-win there. There's a win in having the bursary child come in and get a hopefully a more focused or better education, get more opportunity certainly, as well as to those who are paying the full fee. The parents can be said, right, well actually your child's going to be ready for the world when they graduate from this school. They're not going to be coming out with a silver spoon or in such a bubble.
And I think I think a lot of the reputation that independent schools have from the general public is based around their very limited knowledge of what they see. And so without pinpointing any particular individuals, those who are very prominent in public life very often are associated with private schools, and if we don't like them, we therefore say the private school itself. Now, an interesting fact, Boris Johnson went to Eton College, so did the guy who founded Greenpeace.
Yeah.
This is the dynamic of private schools. I went to a great private school, in London.
And look what it turned out.
Look what it turned out. But I went to a great private school in London, but at a time in the 70s when there were no bursary students apart. There were scholars, but there were no bursary students. So we were in that sort of bubble. Now, we at least were in London. We were predominantly a day school, so maybe we were a little bit more grounded than had we been at a boarding school out in the country. But nevertheless, we were undoubtedly privileged. Now that school raises significant amounts of money every year to support what is the trend, which is transformational bursaries, which is what schools want to do.
Okay, let's talk a bit more about that. We've got school fees for independent schools ranging from a few thousand to tens of thousands every year. If you think about that, to be paid out of after-tax income means that you can be earning six figures as a salary and still not be able to afford to send your children to an independent school. So that's really pushing the middle class in a place. And if you make education a priority for as your family spend rather than second cars or holiday houses or whatever else, you might be able to squeeze the pips. But a transformational bursary is quite something. That is, correct me if I'm wrong, 100% school fees being covered?
Yeah, or even 110%. Or 100% plus some money on top.
What's that? Why?
Because it recognises that not only do you cover the school fees, but there are incidental costs associated to going to a school. So whether that's sports kit, whether that's a school trip,
laptops, things like that,
computer, whatever it might be. And it recognises that if you're going to award 100% bursary, that bursary has to go to somebody who comes from the most humble of origins.
Right.
So,
it's not middle class welfare.
This is not middle class welfare. This is a child with natural ability, be that academic or sporty in some cases, or cultural, music, whatever it might be, who otherwise would never get to a school that can offer them what they need. Right. So what you're genuinely doing is taking somebody from, you're transforming somebody's life by taking them out of an environment where they will be one of a very large number of people at a big state secondary school and giving them an opportunity.
And here, let's remember that purpose might be that they have special needs, or that they have a special gift in sport or music or drama or something. Yeah. That's where the independent school focuses.
You're also recognising, this is where the additional piece comes in, that it would not be fair for that child to go to school every day and then not be able to go on the school trip with all of his or her classmates. Because the family can't afford it. Or it's not fair that if the uniform changes or the sports gear changes, that child doesn't have the same opportunity. So that's where I think it's now been recognised by schools that if you're going to give 100% bursaries, you actually have to give 100% and a little bit more.
There is a foundation that focuses on this, isn't there? Is it Springboard Foundation?
Yeah, so you've got Springboard. It was actually rugby school, and the head of rugby school about 20 odd years ago, by the name of Patrick Derham, who ironically was my neighbour in my first year at university in our university halls of residence. And Patrick had been to Pangbourne and had been to Pangbourne with financial support, and it transformed his life. And he was very much instrumental in setting up the Arnold Foundation at Rugby School, which was very much around bursaries. And then the Springboard Foundation had run up in parallel, and the two sort of come together.
Okay.
The Springboard Foundation raises money and works with schools and a number of different schools to provide bursaries for people on a slightly different format. I think what a lot of schools now recognise is that they can do this themselves. And they can do it because there is an increasing number of people, both alumni and parents, who recognise the value of supporting bursaries. And that's why in the current, what we found out in the IDP survey in 2022, is that somewhere in the region of 85% of independent schools are raising money for bursaries currently.
Yeah. Don't you think the transformational bursary gives us a really good opportunity to demonstrate impact as well, rather than those, part funded, we'll give you 10%, because like you say, Chris, it's a child that never would have that experience and that opportunity, isn't it?
It's a really important motivator, and we've been lucky enough as Gifted to have worked with a lot of schools. Very often we're asked by schools to look at, should we be raising money for bursaries or should we be raising money for a capital build? And we've helped schools, I can think of about 4 or 5, either they've done both, or actually it's, why do you start doing this? Your first campaign, build the culture of fundraising around, say, bursaries, and then you'll be ready for a big capital campaign when you need it. Why? Because bursaries are current. They're relevant. You can always find kids out there from the community who deserve the education that you can offer. It motivates people. And the other beauty of it is, of course, it satisfies both the immediacy of the impact that a major donor might want. In other words, I could fund somebody every year for 6-7 years, get the tax benefit every year, the school gets a commitment, and I know that child is going to be funded, or at lower level to your broad community of schools, and schools are in a very fortunate position. It could be very simple to say you can help us build for the future by giving a modest amount. So, I give £15 and 9p, because 1509 was the year that my school was founded, a month to a bursary fund.
Yeah.
I'm not expecting impact reports from individuals, but what I want to know is that by a certain time, my school will be giving X number of transformational bursaries.
But it's interesting, and I'll come to you on this, Amy. I mean, the history, if you like, of funding into what are now independent schools has been building, if you like, a pool of potential support amongst alumni or old boys and girls, because of the fact so many of them were supported by grants or by assisted places, as they were, and they benefited, if you like, because of that support.
Absolutely.
By getting that education.
Yeah, I saw that in a independent school I worked with in Yorkshire, and a lot of the major donors had been on direct grants.
Right.
And they were saying, it's my duty to give back.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be where I am today had I not had that opportunity.
Those magic words.
And therefore, for me to be able to give that to another child is so powerful for them.
Yeah. And even if they didn't go to that school, they may have gone to a grammar school, because they're of an age where grammar schools existed. When you work with grammar schools now, and you speak to the oldest alumni, they of course went to a grammar school because they came from very humble origins.
Correct. And they would have passed.
And if they've gone on to be successful, they really look back and they say, if I hadn't gone to that grammar school, I would not have got to where I am today.
Yeah.
These days, as we know in the grammar school sector, it's, parents very often will send their kids to private school until the age of 11 to make sure they get through the 11 plus, because they'll take advantage of having a really good grammar school in the area, and that's great. And they will support that grammar school. So parents are great in terms of supporting capital projects. Obviously, grammar schools don't worry about bursaries, but supporting capital projects because they know that they've got opportunity. But let's not underestimate the importance, as Amy says, of what the personal experience, either at your own school or, as I've got in the case of one of my current clients, a very wealthy parent who himself went to a grammar school in another part of the country, who now recognises the importance of
But you were saying, Chris, and again, Amy, please come in. The parents themselves are probably not the most likely source for philanthropic giving at independent schools at the moment. I mean, I think you said 60% won't be there. But certainly around bursaries, the pivot must therefore be to alumni. And to your point about those people having benefited from assisted places and grant schemes, is that what you're seeing? I mean, are they the ones that you would naturally turn to around a bursaries program?
For me, that's the first port of call. But as we've talked about in other conversations, that's where your feasibility study comes in to speak to you.
So that you want their names on your interview list for your feasibility study.
You want to test that mix, don't you, and see.
And do they try and focus some of these bursaries? I mean, and I'm conscious about some of the recognition. If you wanted to fund, if I was an alumni, as I am of a particular, if I wanted to fund a particular, let's say, cricket scholarship bursary, or someone who was interested in, dare I say, politics or history or something. I mean, is that more and more the case, or is it schools resisting the designation, if you like, of bursary funding?
I think it depends slightly on the outlook and nature of the school itself.
Right.
If a school has a particular interest in sport, for example, then it will probably be more open to a bursary funding. And we see in cricket, there's a lot of criticism of the England cricket team being mostly kids who went to independent schools. That is true, but actually at least 50, if not 60% of those England cricketers went to a school on a bursary at a certain point. So people talk about Joe Root went to private school. Well, Joe Root only went to private school when he was 16 for the last 2 years of his career on a scholarship. Before that, he'd gone to the state secondary school in Sheffield where he grew up. So I think we've got to be very aware of that. Now, of course, what is happening in that sport and rugby and other sports, it's happening younger and younger, and it's almost replaced the university sector.
I'm just thinking in Yorkshire, you'd certainly get a bit of scholarship bursary funding for cricket, or for, dare I say, the Headingley scholarship. I don't know.
It's a niche thing, and I think as with any client in any sphere, if a major donor comes along and says, "I'm going to give you X to do Y," then as a school or an institution, you've got to decide whether Y is something you want to do.
Yeah.
But the chances are you'll probably take it.
And what's your view? I mean, do you think that it's right, therefore, that the school reports back on how young Andrew's doing, if to the donor, if they've been funding.
It's challenging, isn't it? Because obviously you can't name a specific child and say this is who you're funding and what have you, but that impact reporting is vital.
Yeah.
The donor wants to know that the child they're funding is succeeding and enjoying life and progressing.
And their money's making a difference.
Absolutely. So there's got to be a level of reporting, whether that's anonymised or not.
Yeah, and how that's managed is a good question, an ethical question.
Yeah,
what do you think, Chris?
Well, I think those who run schools very naturally think we can't talk about. It's unfair to identify bursary students. I think there's that, and they're right. Within the school life of a child, you don't want certain people sort of with a badge on them going, "I'm a bursary student."
Yeah.
But that is very different from an individual donor who may be funding a specific child's education and having a sort of little closed environment whereby the student, who knows they're a bursary student, also understands that one person is paying for it. Now, you have to trust on both sides that the donor isn't going to go, "Oh, and I fund little Freddie over here." Perfectly good for the donor to say, "I fund a bursary." In fact, you want the donor to say, "I fund a bursary," to encourage others to do it. But, and equally, as Amy says, there's no harm in a little thank you note, an impact.
So
this is what the child...
Freddie does a Christmas card back.
Absolutely. Freddie just scored 100. Freddie's got a scholarship to Harvard. Whatever it might be, that's great, because that is a sense of satisfaction. But you know what? I think more than anything else, what is motivating an alumnus donor in particular is they recognise the opportunity they had and what they were given at the school, which would have been a very different place to what it is now, and they want a child to benefit from that.
Yeah.
As more schools have gone co-ed, obviously there's more interest in, from successful women going, actually, I'm going to make it female specific. You don't tend to get it the other way around.
I was going to ask you about that, Chris. So we've done work with girls' schools, boys' schools, and co-ed, haven't we? How is it more challenging, do you think, funding a bursary program for girls' schools and boys? What have we seen over the last couple of years?
Where's the centre of gravity?
It's a very good point. So there are various rules of thumb that I think we discovered as a result of the survey. So the majority of your alumni donors are aged over 55, and at schools that are now co-ed that used to be single-sex boys' schools, the vast majority of it is probably 72% or something are male.
Wow.
So when you're going into a study and you're doing your interview list, who do we want to speak to? We want to speak to alumni over 55 and male. Equally, we know from our work with girls' schools that girls' schools have been less successful with their ongoing relationship and engagement with alumni, not least because alumni change names, female alumni are more likely to change names, and historically the oldest alumni, those who are more inclined to remain in touch because they'll get together and have tea every year on the lawn and with the oldest generation. There are a couple of schools who literally have a function every year that is absolutely that older generation. But they're not going to give. They might leave a legacy, so you want to remain in good touch with them, but they're not going to give, not least because the school's changed. When they were at the school was probably a more, for want of a better expression, feminine environment.
Well, it was certain elements of a finishing school, the etiquette, and they're preparing women for a different role than they are today.
Whereas parents at girls' schools are ambitious for their daughters in the way they maybe wouldn't have been 50 years ago, and therefore they want to invest in facilities that are going to help their ambition.
We've been talking about this for a couple of decades now. I mean, girls' schools have changed, and there have been some really successful, high-powered women go out there into the corporate world, make a shed load of money, and the challenge for the girls' schools is to get as progressive in their asking and engagement of those alumni, and maybe it's around bursaries. Maybe that's the very thing that might just unlock that feminine philanthropic power that is there, that is just not really, I'm not seeing, one or two exceptions of course, but I'm not seeing it in the girls' schools.
Well, it ties back in, Andrew, doesn't it, to what we said about a younger generation being more interested in the environment, social mobility, social welfare. Successful women aged between 40 and 55 are probably far more likely to want to support that sort of cause than they would be the building of a new performing arts centre or the building. Now, there are certain things in girls' schools, STEM buildings, that's really important because there is recognised there is a lack of
underinvestment
over the years. And parents in particular have ambitions for their daughters, and therefore they see STEM as being really important.
So depending on whether it's co-ed, single sex, male, female, whatever, you really need to think carefully about who your potential audience or donor pool might be for a bursary program. And your study's got to be the place to
well, I was just going to say, is it part of the planning then? If it's a girls' school bursary campaign, is it the mix? Is it targeting those, slightly younger women who've done incredibly well, plus a legacy program to build an endowment, rather than those cash gifts now?
So that concept of a planned giving program, they give, like Chris is doing to his school, so much a month, but then balloon at the end with some sort of commitment in a legacy.
I think you're absolutely right. I think one of the beauties of bursary fundraising is it can apply equally successfully at annual fundraising. In other words, that regular lower level giving as it can to a capital campaign. And I think what we're starting to see more and more of, and what we recommend now to a lot of our clients, is let's say you say, we want to raise £5 million for bursaries. Well, actually split that target. Split that between, say, £1.5 million or £2 million that you can start spending pretty much straight away. In other words, an individual donor says, I'm going to pay for a sixth form. So let's say that's £50,000 worth of funding. You can go out and find a sixth form student that can start the following year. And you've got your two.
Immediate impact.
At the same time, by a certain date, we want to have this amount in an endowment, which means that on an average 5%, which is what most people will calculate on, we will be able to give away X, that we'll be able to fund X number of transformational bursaries. That means you can continue fundraising. Your legacies will occasionally come and drop brilliantly because you've got a proactive legacy campaign. And suddenly that target, and then everybody, it's almost like there's something for everybody in that.
I guess if you're raising philanthropic income for your bursary program, it enables you to fine-tune the overall package in a different way, because you've been funding certain elements in the school of bursaries anyway. You get 10 transformational bursaries, let's say. You can now refocus the balance of the income, the income you've got now, in a different way, can't you? You can just look at the whole package.
Particularly from your endowment funds, where you're generally speaking, you've got lots of lower level donors and the odd legacy. That's very different from the impact that you need to be able to give a major donor who's committed themselves to £25,000 a year.
Gotcha.
You need to be able to give them something very tangible, whereas actually the lower level, I don't expect to get individual reports as a £15 a month donor on bursaries. I just want to know that in 10 years' time, the school's giving 150 completely transformational bursaries.
And every school's unique, aren't they? So it's going to be very different for each one, how they deliver that and how they manage it.
And they are of their place. Schools are rooted physically in the place and the community that they serve. And so that's also reflected both in the school's history and its giving history as well.
And again, that also reflects on bursaries, takes us all the way back to the heritage. One of the questions that we will often ask in a study, and remember, we also tend to do the online surveys now to get a bit of quantitative support around certain concepts. Is how local should recipients of bursaries be? And really interestingly, particularly in places, towns where there is a school that's been there for a very long time and has been part of the establishment of the town, it may not be seen to be a great British public school. It's seen to be a very good local school. There, it is very clear, the evidence is very clear, people want support for local kids. Why? Because very often, if you're a parent, your child goes and plays football or rugby on a Sunday morning, and his best friend might be at the local comprehensive school.
And it wouldn't be good if they had the opportunity.
Wouldn't it be great if they had the opportunity to go to that school? So therefore, and of course, what that then does is it also starts to take you beyond just the community of your parents and your alumni, but it may even take you into the territory of some local businesses, particularly in a sort of market town environment, and actually because you're genuinely supporting local people.
Go on, Amy.
I was going to say that was definitely a thing in Manchester with a school project I did there. Local businesses were really keen to hear a bit more about it, which was interesting.
And again, local grant makers, because as we know, if you were doing a capital project at an independent private school, the reality is it's very unlikely that any grant maker can fund it. There are some schools out there, in particular parts of the country, the Northwest is a good example, where there are some very well endowed local charities who will fund bursaries and have been funding bursaries for a long time, but for local kids to go to the local private school.
It's interesting, and I know it's probably a subject for another one of our conversations, but what you've reminded me both today is that if you like, our state-funded schools have forgotten that they, in many cases, were independent schools at the beginning. And I reflect in my own village where we've got a primary school. It's been there. And hanging up in the church tower is the list of the names of the local people that funded the establishment of that school. That it was a local response to the need to educate our children. But long before government got involved in funding, and we see that in some of the state schools we're doing work with now, that actually the local businesses will respond to capital appeals force and in really significant ways. And that's a great headroom, but that, I think, is another debate. The bursary one, though, Chris, is going to be quite interesting to see how things evolve over the coming year, because we've got cost of living crisis hitting capacity for the squeezed middle class, if I could describe them that way, us that way. But equally, we've got changes in government's approach and engagement of independent schools that we're likely to see with the VAT question and so on. So is that going to change the case, do you think, in some ways, or not?
Is it going to change the case? I think some schools are grappling now with, should they be offering, in effect, to cover the VAT costs through bursaries? In other words, they don't want to lose kids, and if there are kids already in the system, should they be considering using their pool of funding, their pool of money, to make sure those kids can complete their education? I think personally, whilst I understand why they want to do that, I think that's fraught with difficulties, and from a fundraising
loses
perspective,
the charitable element, doesn't it?
And I think it also
does,
it appeals less to your donors.
Yeah,
if I'm being honest,
Absolutely.
the win, the positive that's come out of the last year's worth of communications from potential future government is that they're not at this stage going to remove charitable status.
No.
So that does at least mean that schools will continue to be able to fundraise tax effectively.
I think that would be legally actually very difficult to achieve.
And that probably is why they've decided on advice that they're not going to go down that particular path.
Courts on that.
So schools will be able to fundraise. Independent schools have been working very hard to prove their public benefit over the last number of years, often unrecognised. If you read the annual report of most independent schools, you'll see the range of what they do.
Yeah.
It obviously never gets reported in the press, but actually the schools know they're doing a good job. But I do think that bursaries, and particularly transformational bursaries, will give schools the opportunity to say, we do serve the community.
It's a really hot topic at the moment. I mean, I guess we're going to come together and talk again around this. But if I could draw our session to a close just now. Thanks for coming in for today's conversation, and I hope our listeners have found this helpful. Watch this space. We'd love to hear your views. But I think, let's be honest, this is touching a lot of people's lives. Bursaries and the opportunity that this sort of philanthropy has is going to be really, genuinely transformational.
Yeah, and I'd just add, Andrew, as the final piece to all of our schools out there, don't be scared of what's down the line. Get on doing what you do and do it properly.
Very good. Famous final words from Chris. Thank you very much. Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Chris. Good to see you again today. Cheers. Thanks for pulling up a chair and joining our conversation today. Please share any comments or even pose a question for future episodes by emailing us at inquiries@giftedphilanthropy.com.